serendipity is just part of a much bigger conversation, which I've come to call human connectivity. Connectivity is essentially a kind of combination of connecting in order to achieve the connection. Just like every connection is unique and special, I think everybody's kind of definition and experience of joy is probably equally unique and special.
Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Peter, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute delight to be here.
Peter, you've traveled the world bringing people together over food with your Wok and Wine concept. What have you learned about the power of serendipity in fostering meaningful connections?
Oh goodness, that's quite a big question to start out with, Andrea. So serendipity was one of my favorite words back in the kind of heyday of Wok and Wine. And just for your listeners, I'm from New Zealand, and quite often people think I'm saying walk and wine. So it's a wok with a W-O-K, as in the thing you cook in. So I apologize for any dialectic based miscommunications. But Wok and Wine was really about, as we came to describe it, the concept was really about helping people find the people they didn't know they were looking for. So this idea of serendipity, and often referred to as happy accidents, for example, where you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. You're in the supermarket and you reach for the same bunch of bananas as somebody, or you're standing waiting for your luggage to come out on the carousel at an airport and somebody else picks up your luggage by mistake, and you have this kind of chance encounter with someone. And what I was seeing in a lot of the travel that I was doing around the world, and the types of experiences that I was having, is that people were craving these different kinds of connections, and yet actually making them happen in a kind of organized, consistent way is quite difficult. And so I got really interested in understanding if the conditions for serendipity could be designed or engineered, and that's really what Wok and Wine was about, is that helping people to, again, find the people they didn't know they were looking for. Often we go through life with a kind of preconceived notion of exactly who are the people I need to maybe take the next step up the corporate ladder that I'm trying to climb, or to get my way into a particular opportunity, be it it could even be a sports team or something like that, or even finding flatmates when you've moved to a new town. And as humans, we're kind of limited to the beliefs that we carry around with us, and that sort of constrains our ability to think outside of the social circles that we normally run in. And something really magical and beautiful happens when you take people safely beyond the kind of boundaries of their comfort zones, and drop them into the networks, bring them into company with people from very different places, because you start to realize, number one, those people give you access to ideas, opportunities, thoughts, what have you, that you otherwise perhaps wouldn't have found on your own. But secondly, I think that's just as important. You find out that those people who seemed completely different to you are actually very similar and have so much in common. Again, we could talk about this for 2 days, and I don't think I'd run out of things to say, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor of the kind of thinking behind Wok and Wine, the motivation, I guess, and what the real value was, I think, for the people that we managed to bring together.
I love that. And I absolutely love the word serendipity and the purpose that you had. And I was curious if you could maybe share with our listeners how many countries did you travel to, and what is one or several of the most joyful moments or stories that you can share with us from all these connections?
Oh, I love that question. And there was so much joy. It was, I mean, both for myself, but also for the people, we were able to bring together. So in the end, Wok and Wine has taken place in 12 countries around the world, a total of close to 200 events, I think. and really diverse, ranging from an event well, in a abandoned primary school library in Auckland, New Zealand, to a super upmarket art gallery in the central Manhattan. We've been in abandoned buildings in Amsterdam. Really, really interesting kind of mix, not only of the cities that we've been to, or the countries that we've been to, but also the places that we're able to take the concept into. And I think overall the joy, I think that was really reflected in every single event that we did. And this is, I guess, speaking to the universality of the concept, and also the once we got to the point that it was really addressing a fundamental human need, the need for connection. People have that need, anywhere you go in the world, and so it kind of doesn't matter, and it transcends cultural differences, it transcends generational differences, it transcends social differences. And there was always, we spoke about the concept as having three phases. There's the before the prawns, during the prawns, and after the prawns, or if you refer to them as shrimp, before the shrimp, during the shrimp, and after the shrimp. So before the prawns, it was really, people would come in. It was a typical, aside from the fact that we went to these, quite unusual locations, you would come in, there would be a table laid out, the table covered in newspaper and banana leaves. So that was a little bit unusual, but there was a table, and there was a place where you could get a glass of wine. And so people would come in and kind of stand around and do the usual things of trying to figure out, do I know anyone here? Where do I fit in terms of this group? Is this a place that I belong? And I would be, greeting people as they came in, and then I would disappear at a certain point, and I would fire up the wok and start cooking. And then there'd come the time during the prawns. So I'd dump the prawns out along the table, and this just frenzy would be unleashed in the room of people coming together and just really focused on the activity at hand, which was essentially eating with their hands. And the most joyous part for me, I think, was what I describe as after the prawns, or kind of towards the end, when people have finished eating, and you just see people who you knew at the beginning had been somewhat reserved about initiating conversations, and really wondering, like, what am I doing here? Am I in the right place? Is this the kind of place for me? And they would be surrounded by other people, you know captivating a group of people in conversation. And so these people had the the concept, the experience had given them both the confidence and the kind of platform on which, or in which, they could really shine. And that, for me, was absolutely joyous. And then just seeing the joy on people's faces. Sometimes it was really hard to finish an event, to close an event. We always wanted to finish on time, and leave everyone with a kind of sweet taste in their mouth, metaphorically speaking. Sometimes people, like, they would want to stay around and help us tidy up and do the dishes and pack up and everything, because they didn't want it to leave. Thinking from the participant perspective, I mean, again, there have been so many stories of people starting businesses. We know of at least one marriage that came out of Wok and Wine, and if that's not joyous, well, at least I I hope, if they're listening, that's still a joyous connection. But I think the sense of the number of comments we had at the end of an event, of just I've just had the most interesting conversations I've ever had in my life. Or when we were doing events in New York, and people would say, I've lived here for 5 years or 10 years, and I've never been to something like this, where I could just speak so freely with people about so many different topics. And we actually, I was going to say, we referred to it as, but this phrase came from an interview I gave with a journalist in New York. And I was explaining the concept, and he stopped me and he said, this is brilliant. You're basically throwing no reason parties. And this idea of a no reason party really stuck with me as we didn't have an agenda. There wasn't a theme. There wasn't a keynote speaker or anything like that. It was literally creating a safe container that invited people in, completely leveled the playing field, and allowed people just to be people, or to be human. Um, and being able to give that to people, and then really see the change that it created, with them and for them. And yeah, I think I'd probably kind of sum it up as collective joy. I think collective joy is a sort of, combination of everyone experiencing it in very different ways, but together it added up to something quite remarkable.
I really love that collective joy. How beautiful. Share with us how the people were actually selected. Like, help us understand, were people actually seeing an invitation somewhere and they were choosing to join, or did that happen in a different way? Just so we understand how you actually brought together these unique different individuals with possibly different backgrounds, different cultures, and so on. um, and what sparked their curiosity to even want to say, yes, I'm going to go here?
Yeah, again, a great question, and it was really interesting. So I'll start kind of with the opposite or the flip side. So some of the quote unquote worst events that ever happened, and when I say worst, I mean they were fantastic, but just, they didn't have that spark, that magic in the same way. And these were the events where we curated the crowd. So there were people who were separated by 1 or 2 degrees of separation, and so it was, tended to be people from a similar social network, and by that I don't mean necessarily a digital social network, but a group of people who were already familiar with each other. The real magic happened when you brought people together who on paper had nothing in common with each other. They didn't know who each other were. They came from, exactly to your point, very different walks of life, different industries, and so on. The concept, I would say, did that for us. So if you're willing to show up at some random location with a bunch of strangers, the only thing you know for sure is that you're going to be standing at a communal table eating with your hands. That already sets you in a certain group that's not defined demographically, for example, but to use your word, you're curious. And we used to talk about people who are interested and interesting. So people who are so interested being curious, people who are interested are the ones who kind of, they go down that alleyway and follow their curiosity and kind of see where it leads. They take the path that's perhaps less trodden, and in doing those things, they acquire or accrue interesting stories. And there's nothing that interested people like more than hearing interesting stories. And so that was kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy, if you like, where it was that combination. We the people who came who perhaps thought that they didn't belong, or would maybe on their own, as a result of their own motivation, have not purchased a ticket, tended to come in groups. So there'd be someone who found out about the event, and they'd buy 5 tickets and bring 4 other people along with them. And there were a number of incidences that I can think of where people had that type of experience. So they would come in and then they would look to their friend, and they would either ask it literally, or they'd be asking it with their eyes and their facial expression, like, where have you brought me? Like, what is this place? What's this? Nothing in here computes with what I would associate with a kind of social gathering of peers. Those people tended to have the best time because they were so far, I mean, they were taken safely out of their comfort zones, and really, were allowed to just thrive as humans. But we also had really interesting and fun things happening where, for example, we did an event in London in the UK where 2 women showed up, and I started talking to them as they came in. I'd try and kind of greet everybody and have a conversation. And I asked, like, how did you find out about Wok and Wine? And said, oh, you did an event in Sydney, and our friend was there, and she saw that you were coming to London to do an event here, and so she bought us 2 tickets and just said, don't ask me any questions, just go to this thing. You're going to have a great time. And so that started happening more and more as well. We even had I wouldn't quite go so far as to say refer to them as groupies, but we had a number of people who managed, just because of their travel schedules, generally for work, to happen to be at an event that we did in Melbourne in Australia, and then Sydney, and then San Francisco, and then also London, for example. So very organic, very happenstance, very much down to serendipity. And just, yeah, again, to that point, if there was one kind of defining characteristic, I suppose, of the people who came, I would refer back to the word that you used, which is perfect, and that's curiosity. People who were just really curious and wanting to try new things.
Amazing. What is the most surprising lesson that you've learned from your research on human connectivity that has challenged your previous assumptions?
Oh wow, yeah, that's another doozy. So Wok and Wine got me absolutely fascinated with human connectivity. The first, I guess, phase of my career, the first decade of my career was in the creative agency space, so around innovation and strategy and design and increasingly storytelling. And then Wok and Wine was born when I moved to New York, and it ran around the world for for a number of years. And then I moved with my wife to London when she was offered a job in London, and that coincided with me. A couple of things happened. Number one, I had all these questions about Wok and Wine and what was happening, and could we really engineer serendipity? What are the design principles that kind of make it work? And then I met an academic, Dr. Weston Baxter at Imperial College, who was, I mean, we started having interesting conversations, and and he was really fascinated by this topic as well of human connectivity, and so it ended up with me doing a PhD. So I kind of took this subject quite seriously, and I must admit I went into my PhD really banging the serendipity drum, or waving the serendipity flag, thinking like it's going to be all about that. But what I realized as I kind of dug deeper was that serendipity is just part of a much bigger conversation, which I've come to call human connectivity. And what I was seeing was this real, I mean, humans are a social species, we're social creatures. That these kind of headlines that we've seen bantered around, like we need to be connected to others in order to thrive, but also to survive. And at the same time, most people find connecting to others increasingly difficult. So I was thinking with Wok and Wine and kind of unpacking Wok and Wine, if you like, getting it down to the building blocks that made it work. Could we find some things? Could we surface some core principles that would allow us to, or that may be applied in other contexts, that would really help people to make the connections they were needing, be they serendipitous or much more planned connections? And so that was kind of the shift that my research took from purely serendipity focus to more human connectivity. And back to your question, one of the key insights, I mean, there are multiple. You do a PhD and you go quite deep on a subject, but one of the key things that Wok and Wine also really highlighted was a shift that I saw being needed away from putting the onus or the responsibility purely on the individual to say, you need to be a better listener, you need to ask better questions, you need to go on this networking course or workshop or what have you, and instead to kind of zoom out and think, how can we as experienced designers, as leaders of organizations, as community leaders, how can we create the conditions in which connecting has a better chance of happening in the first place? So with Wok and Wine, that was achieved by this sort of crazy experience where there were no rules, and the no reason party, and so on, taking people safely outside their comfort zones, and so forth. But for example, within an organization, we just as a really simple example, we want people to collaborate. We know that collaboration is fundamentally important for creativity and innovation and so on. And yet maybe our incentive structures don't align with the desire to have people collaborating. So people are incentivized to kind of hold their best ideas to themselves, which doesn't serve, the purpose of the organization. Now, if I'm conscious I've made quite a leap there, but essentially that's I think if I was to call out one thing, it's that idea that connection, if you create the right the right conditions, connections almost happen by themselves. And so that's a really fundamental lesson, I think, that I learned, and that many people can kind of take away and think about how that might be applied in their specific context.
So, can you dive deeper into those specific conditions, whether it's in our personal lives or in organizations? Do you have any specific tips for our listeners in terms of optimizing those conditions? And can you also help us understand the key difference between connecting and connection?
Yeah, great. So I'll start with second question and then come back to the first. So I use the term human connectivity quite deliberately, and I got a lot of pushback from this, I must admit, when I started my PhD, because around that time, community building was all the thing, and everyone was talking about community and connection. So it was all about connection, social connection, human connection. And I did my PhD in a design engineering department, which sets my work quite a ways apart from the majority of human connectivity based research or human connectivity focused research that had been done prior, that really sits within the social sciences and management. I learned a lot from that research, and it provided a super solid foundation, but it really focuses our attention on why connections matter. And I wanted to understand, okay, if we all agree that connections are really important, why aren't they working, and what can we do about it? And so if the connection is kind of the outcome, it's the the end result of spending time with people, of investing and building trust, and so on. Connecting is the process through which a person goes in order to achieve that outcome. And so connectivity is essentially a kind of combination of connecting in order to achieve the connection. So hopefully that makes sense. It's perhaps a little nerdy academic, but the terminology really matters. Back to the question of what are specific things that people, organizations, leaders, whatever can be done. And from what I understand from your podcast, it's an incredibly broad and beautifully diverse audience. So there are three kind of categories, if you like, of factors that influence human connectivity outcomes. And this was both the literally and metaphorically the final chapter of my thesis, kind of unpacking these. So at the center, we have individual factors. So these are things that relate to me or to you as an individual before we even show up and attempt to start connecting in the first place. And they have to do with things like our attitude when it comes to connecting to others, how apprehensive we are, and so on. So it's really understanding what are the kind of psychological drivers, challenges that we may have in any social context before we even come into contact with other people. When we think about preparing people, if you like, to be connectivity ready, it's thinking about how can we help people to understand, for example, if we take apprehension, which has its roots right back in our kind of the very, very early days of human existence, and essentially stemming from this challenge that if you weren't accepted into a social group, the consequences were pretty dire. You were going to not have access to the resources that you needed, which was typically food and shelter, or you were going to be at greater risk of predation because you didn't have the kind of critical mass to support yourself. And because of that, humans are incredibly sensitive to rejection. That's where that's the kind of the source of the apprehension. So even in a network setting, in a business type environment, you're not necessarily worried that you're going to be hunted down by a tiger or whatever it is, but still we've kept with us this tendency to be apprehensive about being rejected by others, and so there's, I mean, we could do multiple podcasts about each one of these individual things, but when you understand that and you think, what is it that I can do, for example, as a designer, as a leader, to reduce people's apprehension? So that could just be really simple things like, instead of just opening up a room full of people and saying everybody just go meet each other, how might you start to kind of pre-connect people? So you show up with a buddy or someone that you can connect with when you're in that space. You can plant people within this space whose job it is, for example, to say your sole purpose for this entire event is to make sure that no single person is left standing on their own. And so those kind of things where you're focusing on that point of apprehension and looking to reduce it. The next layer out from that, so we've had individual level factors, then there's social level factors, and these come into play when people come into contact with each other. So you and I meet at an event, or we're put on the same project team, or we turn out happen to be neighbors. We both move into the same community together, and we're neighbors. And here we can think about the kind of interplay that happens between people, and what are the individual factors that start to challenge our ability to make the connections that we need. And here you start to play with things like authority, for example. So if I've just joined an organization and you are my boss and you're several levels higher, there's an imbalance of authority there, because I'm the junior person, you're the senior person. That brings with it all kinds of challenges around, like, what are the rules when it comes to interacting with you as my senior, but also, thinking about if you're looking to derive value of some kind from me as your junior colleague, what are the things that could get in the way there? Asymmetry is another one where I feel like, and you often see this in areas where people have deep expertise. So I feel like I've got more to get than I do to give. And so I start to feel guilty about, I'm getting all this information from you, but what am I giving back? And so a lot of it is really helping people to understand where these challenges may lie, and start to think about, is that a real problem? And if it is, for example, in the case of authority, how can I start to introduce things that allow us to find common ground, even though you're way my senior? Maybe there's something that we're both really interested in, a sport, a hobby, a place in the world, or what have you. The outside layer, so the third category, we've had individual, we've had social, is contextual. And this is kind of everything outside of the connecting individuals. And here we start to think about, one of the key things that came out of my research is what I call appropriateness. And here we're talking about the appropriate social norms that kind of dictate how people engage with each other. So say we are both working in an American firm based in the UK, where the CEO is Swiss, and we're working on a design team where we have colleagues from Italy, Argentina, Australia, and Nigeria. Which is the dominant set of social norms that should dictate how we engage with each other? Should we be more like our Italian colleague and much more kind of emotional and expressive, or should we be more like our Swiss CEO, who's very kind of organized and straight, and you don't necessarily show as much emotion? So thinking about kind of social norms. The other one that I'll share, and I'm conscious that that's been a long response to the question, is architecture. So both the built environment, but also digital architecture, and how is the spaces in which we congregate, or in which we bring people in order to congregate, how do they support people in making the connections that they want to make? So are we giving people enough, for example, private space that they can have the kind of conversations they want to have, but also, are we using the architecture of a space that brings people kind of naturally into proximity with each other, that those serendipitous connections that we were speaking about earlier are more likely to happen? So there's a set of, out of my research, there were 19 of these design prompts, 19 of these factors, and essentially what it does is provide a much more high fidelity kind of look, or a high fidelity lens that you can look through your particular situation to understand, okay, which one of these things might be affecting my ability to make the connections that I'm looking to make, or that my team isn't quite connecting as they should, or as that I would have hoped. Help me explain kind of what exactly is going on there.
It's really, really interesting, because a lot of the points you brought to the surface actually are often subconscious, right? And this leads to specific behaviors or beliefs that we may have that actually influence our actions. And I was wondering if you could share with us, particularly with so much of our communication happening digitally in today's world, and if we talk about joy, do you believe that joy can still be found in these virtual and digital environments? Or from your research, do you believe that it's more the face to face interactions that remain essential to experiencing true joy, synchronicity, and connection, or human connectivity, as you call it?
Yes, I mean, it's a beautiful question, and it's a really important one. So I think I'd start out by saying I'm definitely from the camp that sees technology as a means, not an end. So it's a thing that can really support us. I mean, we wouldn't be able to be having this conversation right now were it not for the technology that's allowing it. At the same time, I you can assume that I have a body below my chest, which I do, but we're deprived of so much. Even I'm conscious with my hands that I'm gesturing wildly, and I don't think you have full view of that, and so we're certainly in these kind of contexts deprived of much of the kind of full picture that you get when you're meeting in person. We're also deprived of our other senses. So the sense of smell, for example, and the sense of touch. I can touch my desk, but for many cultures, touching is a really important part of the way they communicate. And I don't mean that in inappropriate ways, but just like grabbing someone's arm or touching the shoulder or whatever when you're making a point. So I think, I mean, the cop out answer for this question is always it depends, because it really does depend. On the one hand, you could say there is nothing quite like sitting in the same space as somebody with things going on around us, where it may not actually be, you would hope that we would have a brilliant conversation, but there could be something else happening in the room or the coffee shop or the restaurant or whatever that we are, that kind of sparks a conversation going in a different direction. And that's just not possible in this space. I think one of the aspects of joy that we really learned through the pandemic, because we were forced into these situations, was we were taken virtually into people's private spaces, into their living rooms, into their kitchens, and so on. And so what that did was give us a bit of a glimpse into, you've got a colleague who's always sat next to you at the office, and then suddenly you see, oh, you've got really interesting pictures on your wall, or you've got a racing bike in the background. I didn't know you were into road racing, or you see that they've got kids, or their cat walks across their keyboard, or whatever else. So I think there are those kind of things that happened a little bit by accident that really did give us, ultimately, thinking about joy from a human connectivity perspective or through a human connectivity lens. It's about, joy comes from meeting real humans in real contexts, in kind of truly authentic ways. It's about meeting the real person behind the job title, behind the LinkedIn profile, behind the CV, or whatever it might be. Because once we get to meet the real person, that's where the magic exists. And I think, going back to the Wok and Wine example, that's what made it, because there was no reason for people to be there. There wasn't a theme or something. You didn't have to, it wasn't performative in the sense that you had to be the smartest person in the room, speaking about AI or about cryptocurrency or about, mergers and acquisitions, or about, product design, or whatever it happened to be. I think there's a tendency with the kind of pace of change that we've seen with digital communication, digital connectivity, to kind of sometimes maybe over index on the technology and forget that it should be in service of the pursuit of joy. So just think about when was the last time you just had a phone call with someone with the video turned off and you could really focus on their voice? When was the how can you bring other lighthearted elements into a conversation to invoke positive emotions, and get people laughing and what have you, and just really focus on, I guess, being one of the challenges, I suppose, with a lot of digital technologies, is that it's more difficult to be present, because we're, again, I'm looking at you right now, and I've got the rest of my screen around me. I've got the stuff going on in my space, and so I think that makes it, I guess then we can get into a conversation about the interplay between distraction and joy, and the kind of, to what extent might we experience a kind of dilution of joy because we're not able to be fully in the moment, and not able to fully express everything that we want to express. For some people, I think the shift to more digital connectivity was absolutely joyous, because they are people who found it really difficult to be in a room and to have their voice heard. And if you're in certain either community environments, or definitely in work environments, where there are really dominant voices in the room, and you happen to be an incredibly smart person, but you're just not quite as dominant, or there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of giving, whether it's the underprivileged or underrepresented voices in organizations, the space. And I think so. I guess that would be another. I mean, there we're getting quite deep and maybe off topic, but I think from the, you're the expert on joy, so I'm not going to propose that I know more, but I think thinking about, just like every connection is unique and special, I think everybody's kind of definition and experience of joy is probably equally unique and special, and it's just kind of understanding what exactly is, and just and stopping to remind ourselves that what brings me joy is not necessarily the same thing that brings you joy, or any of your readers, and really taking the time to understand that, and then you can absolutely build components in, I guess, to digital communications to take steps towards that. But again, closing the circle, I would always go back to, if you're able to meet in person, then that's where I derive the most joy. Absolutely.
If there would actually be a recipe for experiencing more joy in life, what would be, according to you, the top three ingredients?
Oh boy. um I think slowing down is a really critical one, and kind of baked into that is just stopping and being present and just being grateful for what we have. We currently live in London, and we have a small garden. I call it my farm. And there are only a few things that we can grow, but one of those things is raspberries. And I started doing this thing with my wife and kids, that we would, the first raspberry of the season, we would take it and just basically put it in our mouths and just have a moment that we're just appreciating that came from, like, that wasn't there last year. And I think we're just racing through life. I had this conversation, bringing it back to human connectivity, this conversation earlier this week with a friend, where we were talking about our tendency on LinkedIn, for example, to be acquiring new connections all the time. And how often do we kind of stop and look in the rearview mirror about the amazing people we already know, and sending them messages, and just saying how are you, and so on. So I think that's, well, I don't know. Is that one thing? Is that multiple things on your list of three? The second is, and this is something that I find really challenging, is just the understanding our own version of joy may be quite different to someone else's version. And so here we try and avoid the kind of keeping up with the Joneses, and this sense of having to constantly be on, constantly be performing, constantly be keeping up, and just understanding that who we are is enough, and that is the version, the real version of ourselves, is the version that people want to meet. They don't want to meet the kind of fabricated, photoshopped version that's living the perfect life. Like, they want to meet the real human. I think a third thing is just to play more. If I have to think of a third thing, and again, this is speaking for myself, but having young children is a great excuse to be, to kind of make a fool of yourself a bit, which is great. I just started a hip hop improv class, which for me is kind of taking me way out of my comfort zone, but in a way that just, it's going to a space where I'm granting myself permission to not be good at something, and to kind of play around. And so that kind of thing, I think, where we're not taking ourselves quite so seriously, that would be my third.
Love all those suggestions. I also wanted to ask you about the topic of vulnerability, just briefly. What are your views on the importance of vulnerability when it comes to forming deeper connections with others? How do we go about it in a joyful way rather than in a fearful way?
Number one, great question, and also the framing, I think, is really nice, of thinking about, because I mean, there are kind of two sides. There's the intense and an incredible beauty of vulnerability, but there's also the, potentially scarier side. I would say, in terms of its importance, absolutely, and whether, with a lot of these terms that get bantered around, vulnerability is one diversity is another one, community is another one. But I think first of all we have to really understand what we mean by vulnerability, and is my definition the same as yours? Is the thing that I'm trying to achieve something that resonates with you as my audience, or my team, or whatever that might be. So before kind of launching into it and assuming that we're talking about the same thing, I think that's really, really critical. I would say, back to what I was describing with Wok and Wine, and also the final kind of set of factors that came out of my thesis around the sort of contextual factors, the containers that we create in which people are coexisting. And here we can talk about creating safe spaces, and of course safe spaces are not just physically safe but also psychologically safe, and that's absolutely critical. I think if you want people to be vulnerable, what can quite often happen is that there's a workshop or whatever that's done, and it's more tokenism than really genuine in its intent. And so you get typically the less senior people of the organization participating in something that pushes them way outside their comfort zone, but the leader isn't necessarily in the room. And so I think being aware of those kind of things as well, and the perception that can give to your people, and thinking about where what is the, I guess, yeah, back to what I was saying before, like what are you really trying to achieve by having people be vulnerable, and are your intentions genuine and authentic, and kind of working towards a common good that's not just going to serve you as the community leader, as the community manager, as the the team leader in an organization, or the CEO, whatever it is, but that it's actually going to serve the people that you are asking to be vulnerable.
Wonderful. Peter, how can people get in contact with you and learn more about your work?
Well, the best way to get in touch with me is on LinkedIn. So if you look up Peter Mandeno, it's a unique enough name that I'm easy to find. I recently launched betterconnected.world, which is going to be the website that holds most of my thinking and so on. So I'd say those are probably the two best places to get in touch.
Okay, wonderful. Peter, it has been a true joy to spend this podcast with you. I'm very grateful for your time and all the wisdom you have shared.
You're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.